Hey, welcome to Billy's Books. I'm going to try to do two books today. The first of the two is The Hate You Give. I don't know if you can see that. That's the cover that's the cover art. I don't actually have the book in hand, so I'm just going to show you this. The Hate You Give it's kind of funny coming from me, middle-aged white man. It's a young adult book written for a young, or about, the subject is the protagonist is a young African-American girl in high school. She lives in the hood, but she goes to another school elsewhere with mostly white kids, and it's appropriate for those of us in St. Louis. I know people associate St. Louis with Ferguson. This book clearly has Ferguson and equivalent problems all over the country in mind. The protagonist, her name is Star, and one of her friends is killed by a cop, and lots of stuff goes down, both in her community and the community at large. She becomes the center of attention after a while, and she has, and even within the hood, there's various allegiances and alliances, and she has to balance those, and her family has to balance those with each other, and there's conflicts within families and within gangs and everything like that, and it's really messy. Meanwhile, the world at large, while she sees her friend as a victim, clearly shot inappropriately by a cop, the rest of the world is like saying he was a thug and all this kind of usual stuff, and she has to deal with that. She actually hides that she was involved in it for a while from her kids in school, and that has its own interesting manifestations and things like that. It's really, I think it's a really good book. It's seen through the perspective of a teenager, and so sometimes the thought process is more adolescent than an adult might see through it, but at the same time she's also really wise for her age, and you shouldn't underestimate the wisdom of teenagers in general. They are in some ways wiser than their adults, through lack of hardening or cynicization that grows later. So it's a really good thing, and anyway, I like it. I'm going to be brief about this one, but once again, The Hate You Give is a cool book. I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know about that, but I recommend it. I think it's pretty insightful, and sadly enough, its relevance. Also, I'm wearing this hood. This is you could say this is in solidarity with Trayvon and the many other people who have been shot by the cops. Second book, you could also say this hood is a Jedi hood. That brings me to my next book, which I'm still working on, and that is crap, I don't have it with me. So the second book I have is another Star Wars book. It's always another Star Wars book. Love me some Star Wars books. This one is Master and Apprentice, and the Master is Qui-Gon Jinn, and the Apprentice is Obi-Wan Kenobi, an adolescent 17-year-old, just about the same age as Star, in fact. So we all think of Obi-Wan as a pretty smart guy, pretty logical dude, but he at one time was a teenager and doesn't always think logically, though he was a pretty smart teenager. He still was, had emotional issues, sometimes that he had to work out. Master and Apprentice is not just about Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn, Master and Apprentice, but it's actually, they call it Master and Apprentice rather than just the two of them because there's a lot of other relationships, student and teacher relationships, that are alluded to and paralleled in these stories. The whole breakdown of all the different, just get you a sort of a sequence here. Yoda was Dooku's master, Count Dooku. Count Dooku was Qui-Gon Jinn's master. Qui-Gon Jinn then, of course, had Obi-Wan as his Padawan, aka apprentice. And then, of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi, he in some ways had two students, both named Skywalker, one for a long time and one very short, unfortunately, who was then raised, interestingly enough, or trained by Yoda, which brings it full circle. And that's interesting because Obi-Wan Kenobi you, my best imitation of Obi-Wan Kenobi is Anakin. You know, like he's sort of sternly yelling at him. That's like the standard thing. So, because Skywalker, as you know, Anakin Skywalker was a bit of a loose cannon, right? But Obi-Wan Kenobi was relatively uptight, or by the book. So what's interesting to me is that Qui-Gon Jinn was frustrated with Kenobi because he was so inflexible. It's because he was like, he's got to go by the book, and Obi-Wan was frustrated because Qui-Gon Jinn was not by the book, and he was frustrated by that and didn't quite understand it. So Kenobi had it coming from both sides. They mention actually there's a bit of a cycle. If you're, you know, like in the 80s, all the hippies' children became young Republicans and such. It sort of cycles back and forth. If your parents are uptight, then you're a loose cannon, and vice versa. Oversimplifying, but hey, that's what we do. Qui-Gon Jinn doubts Obi-Wan a lot, and he's like, he doubts his judgment sometimes, and he also is frustrated that they don't have a better rapport, but he also doubts that perhaps his own training is to blame. Early on, Qui-Gon Jinn is invited to join the Jedi Council, which puts his relationship or apprenticeship with Obi-Wan in jeopardy, and he thinks about it. He's not sure if he wants to do it or not, and he thinks about it. He's also offended that Yoda was the one person who voted against him joining Jedi Council, so he harbors his own resentment quietly towards Yoda, the same way that Obi-Wan feels that Qui-Gon doesn't value him, and he hides the decision of whether to join the Jedi Council from Obi-Wan. Of course, some big mouth says it in front of him, so that he hears it from somebody else, which makes the problem even worse. They're studying the prophecies, the ancient Jedi prophecies from 10,000 years ago. Let me see. Count Dooku was really freaked out by the ancient prophecies, and warned Qui-Gon not to study them because they lead to the dark side. Seeking the future leads to the dark side. Qui-Gon Jinn was as a result, all the more fascinated by them. And then when he had Kenobi as his Padawan, he had him studying these ancient prophecies, and of course Obi-Wan, being by the book and very straight, is very skeptical, and they have interesting conversations about that. Meanwhile, their mission, this is kind of like in one of many of these Jedi novels, there's some sort of mission they go on, and they flash back and forth between the present and the past. The present, of course, being still before Episode 1, because Obi-Wan is still Qui-Gon Jinn's Padawan. Anyway, so they're jumping back and forth. It's kind of like another one of those things where they're trying to solve a mystery, and the mystery is who's trying to kill the princess on this planet. And there is a Jedi who's assigned to this planet as a regent to protect this princess who's 9 years old, and his name is Rael Averroes. And he was a really, really loose cannon, and another Padawan of Dooku before Qui-Gon Jinn. And since Qui-Gon Jinn was always intimidated by Dooku, who was very, very cold and stern, and they never warmed up to each other, Rael was a really ridiculous kind of. He was an exception because he entered the Jedi so late, because usually Padawans are supposed to enter like when they're just little tiny toddlers, but he joined almost when he was an adolescent. He had been Dooku's Padawan, and then when he became a full Jedi, he had his own Padawan. They went into battle, and his Padawan was young and inexperienced, and they went into battle, and instead of going by the book, Rael took a different approach, which eventually led to his Padawan getting killed, and he feels terrible about that, and all of the Jedi judge him, and he feels terrible, and he feels even more out of place as a result of this. And then he goes to this planet to become the regent, and the Jedi Council sent him to this planet to become a regent to sort of overcome some of his problems dealing with the fact that he sacrificed his Padawan unnecessarily. But of course word gets around there, so they all kind of resent him at this planet, and also he has this self-fulfilling prophecy. There's that word again, where he expects everyone to hate him, so he withdraws and creates his own problems. It's a classic psychological thing. He overcompensates for losing his Padawan by being ridiculously almost blindly protective of the princess to whom he's assigned. A couple other minor characters that I think are very interesting. There is these two sort of outside non-Jedi people who are like the, roughly called jewel thieves, who are actually relatively, they're nice jewel thieves. And there's two of them. One of them is named Pax, and he had been raised, he's really antisocial because he'd been raised by droids, specifically protocol droids or whatever. And so he's been raised by, there's like in a scene here where there's a big argument between G3PO and C3PO and B3PO. Meanwhile, his partner, Rahara, is an escaped slave. And she's an escaped slave from, I'm going to try to pronounce it, Cherka Corps, I don't know, CZ, Cherka Corporation. And Cherka Corporation have their, they've been serving this planet for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they're really entrenched in the political system. And but unfortunately, even though they're part of the Republic, their unofficial slavery is still allowed because it's a corporate matter. And so the Jedi's in this book and the other politicians in this are like, how can the Republic allow slavery? What's up with that? Why do we even exist? Why does the Republic even exist if it allows slavery? I think that Claudia Gray, the author, has quite a bit of insight into the hearts and minds of men and women. You get to see the same action interpreted by different characters throughout the book and how they deal with it differently, and I think it's quite cool. So another fun book, Master and Apprentice, Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn. If you can't do, review.